Alright, so today we're going to be taking a look at the biggest empire in history, the British Empire, in just 10 minutes. So let's start off with the beginnings of the British Empire, which began way back in the 16th century with the first British overseas settlements being established in the Americas, specifically in what is today the northeastern part of North America. And this was during the era of exploration, when European powers were racing to establish new trade routes to Asia, which was incredibly important because Asia had a monopoly on many luxury goods that Europeans wanted, like silk and spices. And so England would establish several colonies in this part of North America. But these early attempts at empire were fragile, and they constantly teetered on the edge of failure. They were often underfunded, and the colonies themselves were very small and vulnerable to attacks from both native populations as well as rival European powers such as the Spanish and the French. So, as a result, the colonies that England established in North America during this time period were not very successful, and most of them would actually end up being abandoned. However, one of them would go on to become one of the most important colonies in all of history. That colony would be Virginia, or more specifically, Jamestown, which would eventually grow into one of the largest and most powerful colonies in all of North America. Okay, now during this time, there was another European power who was also trying to build an empire. This power was Portugal, and its empire was centered around Africa and Asia. The Portuguese had established trading posts along the coast of Africa, and they even controlled areas like Goa and Macau in Asia. But the Portuguese Empire wasn't built on exploration and expansion like the British Empire would be. No! The Portuguese Empire was built on trade and wealth. They were more interested in controlling areas with valuable resources and trade routes, rather than expanding their territory for its own sake. Okay, now, meanwhile, back in England, Queen Elizabeth I had recently come into power, and she wanted to transform England from this small island nation into a global empire. And her solution to accomplish this goal was quite simple. She just needed to find a new area to colonize. After all of their previous attempts have failed. And so, Elizabeth commissioned Sir Francis Drake to sail around the world and find a new area for England to colonize. Drake would eventually find it in the form of what is today known as California. Now, he never actually made any claims to the land because at the time it was still owned by Spain, but Elizabeth did claim California for England shortly after hearing about the discovery. And so, Elizabeth sent an expedition led by Sir Francis Drake to claim the area and establish an English settlement. But once again, this attempt at colonization would fail. But this time, it wasn't due to underfunding or lack of support from the English people. This time, it was due to the might of the Spanish Empire. The Spanish had already claimed much of the Americas, and they saw the English as a threat to their empire, and so they sent a fleet of ships to destroy the English settlement. But Drake and his men were able to fight off the Spanish and establish the first permanent English settlement in North America, which would later grow into the colony of Virginia. Now, while the English were establishing their empire in North America, another European power was doing the exact same thing in South America. This power was the Netherlands, and their empire would eventually span much of South America, including what is today Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and but the Dutch weren't interested in having just one colony. Oh no, they wanted more. And so they would eventually establish colonies all over the world, including in Asia, Africa, and even Australia. But the Dutch wouldn't stop there. They also started to encroach on Spanish territory by stealing their resources and capturing their ships. This constant fighting with the Spanish would eventually lead to the Anglo-Dutch War, which would see the British defeat the Dutch and take control of many of their colonies. This would include the Dutch colonies in North America, which would eventually become New York. With the acquisition of New York, the British Empire was beginning to take shape. They now had colonies all over the world, including in North America, South America, Africa, and Asia. And so now, all they needed to do was to expand these colonies and make them into a true empire. This is exactly what they would do during the 17th and 18th centuries, as they would conquer many Native American tribes, steal resources from the Dutch and Spanish, and capture many Asian cities. This would allow them to gain control of many valuable resources like sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which would help fuel their economy and make them one of the richest nations in Europe. it would also allow them to build up their navy, which would eventually become the largest and most powerful navy in the world. And this navy would be key to the British Empire's success, as it would allow them to project power all over the world and protect their colonies from attacks. However, as the British Empire grew, so did the number of enemies that they had. One of their greatest rivals during this time was France, which had its own colonies in North America. The French and Indian War would be fought between the British and the French over control of North America, and the British would eventually win, which would give them control of all of North America, except for Cuba and the Bahamas. With the victory over the French, the British Empire was now the largest empire in the world. They had colonies on every continent, and they were the most powerful nation on Earth. But this wouldn't last forever, as the American Revolution would eventually break out, which would see the 13 colonies in North America declare independence from the British. This will be a major blow to the British Empire, as it would reduce their size by a significant amount, and it would also damage their economy and their prestige on the world stage. But the British would recover from this setback, and they would continue to grow their empire. They would conquer large parts of India, and they would also take control of many Caribbean islands, including Cuba and the Bahamas. In the early 19th century, the British Empire was at its largest. They controlled about a quarter of the world's landmass, and they ruled over about a quarter of the world's population. But the 19th century would also mark the beginning of the end for the British Empire, as the other European powers began to industrialize and they started to challenge British dominance. One of the most important of these powers was Germany, which had become a major economic and military power by the late 19th century. The competition with Germany would force the British to focus more on their European empire rather than their overseas empire, and this would eventually lead to the decline of the British Empire. By the 20th century, the British Empire had become a shadow of its former self. They had lost most of their colonies, and they were no longer the most powerful nation on Earth. But despite this, the British Empire would still exist in one form or another until today. And it continues to influence global politics and culture in big ways. Okay, so there you have it. The British Empire in just 10 minutes. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to watch another video right now, I recommend you watch the next one.